Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for staying with us and also joining for those that just came to join us during the lunchtime or just after. My name is Agnieszka Kolek and I'm the head of cultural engagement at MCC Brussels. And I'm very pleased to also see quite a lot of guests that I linked up on LinkedIn. It's a great tool for connecting and inspiring different professionals to actually discuss all of these pressing issues. And I think we are very lucky to have a very distinguished panel of guests. And we're going to discuss a panel titled Insecure, Incoherent, Unstable, Europe in a Relativist Age. Most analysts agree that the era of Western hegemony has come to an end. But what replaces it and how should we adapt? Here, I would like to also say from my side that I think maybe this is what the elites think, because I think average citizen doesn't agree that we are finished. And I'm very curious to hear later on the voices from the floor with comments and questions. What do you think about that? It seems that European elites find these questions especially difficult to answer. Defining one straightforward ideas such as patriotism, national interest, or sovereignty has become increasingly difficult for European societies and its elites. Many European leaders prefer the elite jargon of diversity and inclusion to the hard-nosed reality of international politics. It sometimes seems that without any strong ideas, Europeans have been sleepwalking into a crisis. Even a war in Europe has not been enough to shake Europeans from clinging to old fictions, narratives. If the idea of European strategic autonomy lacks any real substance, that it was mentioned in the previous session, might this be because our elites are simply incapable of conceiving of a vision which might attract support and loyalty? After all, Europe is a collection of very different national cultures. Despite any similarities, what could a strategy for such a diverse group even look like? Now, mentioned before, the election of Donald Trump. Is this all set to change? Are Europeans likely to finally discover a strategic vision for Europe? These questions and others I do hope we will be able to answer with our distinguished panel of guests. In order of speaking, I would like to introduce Bill Durodi, visiting professor at MCC Brussels, Ashley Rindberg, investigative journalist, author, The Great Lady Winked, How the New York Times Misreporting, Distortions and Fabrications Radically Alter History. Ralf Schollhammer, assistant professor of international relations at Webster Vienna Private University, also visiting fellow at MCC Budapest. Now, I would like my guest speakers to take 10 minutes each, not longer, because we want to hear the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizers. I have to apologize for having missed the dinner for speakers last night. That's because I was still teaching my students yesterday. And I thought it'd be an apt place to start. It was a class on terrorism. And it came as a surprise to my students that in 1911, Trotsky wrote an essay explaining why Bolsheviks oppose acts of individual terror. Now, I'm not asking you to become Bolsheviks today, but his reasons are worth understanding. Killing a factory owner or assassinating a president simply leads to their replacement with more security, which makes the job of transforming society, which is actually what you really want, even harder. And that points to the biggest problem of all. Individual terror belittles the role of the masses in their own consciousness. Today, our elites look to bypass the public too, or at least act on their behalf. I'm not suggesting that they're terrorists. We also ourselves outsource decisions to them too. But if we want to change things, we need to both act, but also engage the public, not just act for them. Now, of course, elites are very good at talking a good show. Take back control. we have to take back control. I'm not channeling the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but rather Emmanuel Macron, speaking at the 5th European Political Community Summit in Budapest the day after Donald Trump was confirmed as US President-elect. Now, some conservatives might naively be fooled by his radical-sounding rhetoric. We have to defend the interests of Europeans. We have to write our own history. We have to have faith and trust in what we represent. And we have to believe in our sovereignty, he said. But in fact, the word Macron used the most in his speech was we. But by that, he doesn't really mean you and me. The we he has in mind, who should do all these things, are the professional managerial elites like himself. Indeed, in his speech, he pointed to the 700 million people who live in the European political community area and relegated them to being mere inhabitants or consumers. Macron also fixated on a list of challenges: war, terror, migration, climate change, the environment, the US, China. But you know, if you perceive everything as a challenge, and he left out artificial intelligence and populism in his list, but if you perceive everything as a challenge, that may say something more about you than about the problems that you project. The key is to actually understand the provenance of those challenges. His words implied, like many others posing as radicals, whether right-wing radicals or left-wing radicals, that the problems come from outside. He noted that open economies are undermined by third country subsidies, that open democracy can be preyed upon by external propaganda. I want to focus on one superficially minor element of his speech that touched on the need for energy security and electricity interconnectedness. How boring can I be? 15 years ago, I helped coordinate an EU-funded and EU-wide review of the electricity supply chain across Europe for Chatham House, the international relations think tank in London. We found, unsurprisingly maybe, that after 9/11, most of the resources to assure the supply of electricity across borders had gone into hard protection measures to enhance physical security at power stations and substations. But in fact, many problems stemmed from the aging infrastructure that hasn't been updated since the end of the Second World War. But the key challenge had little to do with terrorism and security, or even science and technology, but rather our cultural attitude towards development itself. While superficially a technical problem, the electricity supply chain is a complex, interlinked network that connects people from wildly different backgrounds, both as producers and consumers. The unifying element is an understanding that our world depends on the efficient supply and delivery of energy. We noted a decade before Greta Thunberg's school protest that there was a culture emerging in the West that opposes these aims, and that if we fail to celebrate human ingenuity and our technical achievements, this could undermine the moral confidence that underlay the actual resilience of the entire energy system. Fast forward 15 years, and we live at a time where it's hard to imagine how or why any ambitious young person would want to have anything to do with becoming a part of this industry. Fossil fuel production, which continues to power most of the electricity used by those who critique it, remains a core and essential component. But who would look to go into that now or talk of their profession with pride? In a similar vein, the British government and others have announced their plans to phase out gas boilers in homes in favour of more costly, space-consuming and less efficient heat pumps. You have to wonder who would invest time and money in training to become an engineer today. Inevitably, businesses slow down their innovation rate and begin to close down their facilities everywhere with an impact on jobs. Rather than looking for ways to increase the efficiency of energy production, we're continuously exhorted to reduce our demand. Today is the first age in which less has become a radical demand. Notably, no foreign army or ideology imposed this upon us. Right across the board, as energy production is questioned and supplies become less reliable, we're chastised for our supposed profligacy in its use on the grounds that the planet cannot take it, so human energies and passions turn elsewhere or become attenuated. Businesses in Germany are quite literally relocating to the US or closing down for good. So science, technology, and security are human and cultural issues, first and foremost. The culture wars are not simply about a narrow concept of culture to do with museums and art or how we use language, important as those things are. Cultural pessimism and low expectations impact everything. Macron also played to the gallery by noting how illegal migration hinders societies. He mentioned this several times in his speech. Now, don't get me wrong, there clearly are some challenges associated with mass migration, but it is invariably pessimists who look to blame others for their own failures, whether these be the migrants themselves or those who facilitate them, or the presumed necessity of dealing with the destabilizing consequences of their presence. But if we go back 100 years, the United States was made and built by migrants. All societies have successfully absorbed migrants if they are clear as to who they are, what they stand for, and where they're going. The US offered a dream, a manifest destiny, and a land of the free. So why does that not appear to work anymore? Some of you may know the work of Robert Putnam, famous for his work a couple of decades ago on social capital. What's less known is he followed this up by investigating the effects of diversity on society. He was so troubled by what he found that he only published a paper on this 6 years after having released his data sets. In the short term, other things being equal, by which he meant controlling for income inequality and crime rates, more diversity in a community is associated with less trust, both among and within the different ethnic groups. Diversity seems to trigger not division, but social isolation. In his words, people hunker down. He delayed publication so he could develop proposals to compensate for the negative effects of diversity, arguing that in the long run, immigration and diversity are likely to have important cultural, economic, fiscal, and developmental benefits. But presumably, the key to this long run is integration or socialization. But integration into what? Focusing on the problems caused by migration, and again, don't get me wrong, there are problems, but focusing on these is to become fixated on the consequences of the challenge, not the cause. Few in Brussels know what they want migrants to be integrated into, or like terrorist de-radicalization programs that I used to work with in Singapore, they don't ask themselves the question, de-radicalized to what? Europe today does not know what it is for. How can you inspire anybody with that? No wonder migrants hold on to the little that they have from their past. Young people today are looking for things to belong to and to believe in. And if we fail to offer them this, they'll begin to look for that somewhere else. Macron was right to note, and I'll finish on this, that our shared heritage and how Europe has actually all it needs to be successful. But he ignored at his peril the extent to which Europe has become politically exhausted, leading people to blame others. It's because Europe is lost that immigration has become politically fraught, not the other way round. The European Union, above all others, has replaced the informal, organic social relations of people that take years to forge and emerge with formal codes and rules for everything. It's moved away from a human-centered world to bureaucratic rules that view people as problems to be managed. We've become deracinated from our past and desocialized as a result. Immigrants did not de-Christianize us. That was well underway. They didn't demand that Christmas be rebranded as Winterval. That's why our history, our values, and our traditions are so important to uphold. What's most missing today on the horizon are other cultural factors such as moral courage and imagination. If we believe in nothing, then everything outside appears as a threat. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ashley Rinsberg. I am a journalist, as mentioned. I'm also an author. The book is called The Gray Lady Winked. If you've got your phones open, go to Amazon, buy it. I'm also someone who's been in and around media for my entire career. That's about 20 years at this point, a little more, a little less. And that's all to say that I'm here to talk about this topic in the framework of media and what this means, because there's just no getting around it. There's this great quote that I love from Fran Lebowitz, an important New York figure of the 1970s and 80s, who said at that time, actually it was in a Scorsese documentary that she did on her, that the media has replaced all institutions. And that's certainly true in the United States. Whether that's true in Europe, I don't know. But what we are seeing is that the media has played into this dynamic, and in some ways it's precipitated it. It's really played this pivotal role in feeding us the meat we need to tear each other apart and to tear our own societies apart. It does it day after day. It's gotten financial incentive to do this. It's motivated by clicks and page views and time on page, and bloody stories about whatever it might be do really well, and so do stories that are radicalized in their own nature. I think a lot of you in this room probably have heard the term clash of civilizations. And I think there's obviously something very astute about that term that Huntington coined or at least used prominently. But I think what we're looking at today is actually a little bit different, which is clash of civilization, singular, because this is a clash of a civilization within itself. We are at war with ourselves, and again, thinking about the way that the media has fomented this war, I'll give you one example, which is in the lead up to the pandemic and during the pandemic, we saw this really rise to a crescendo in a very nightmarish way. So we have in August 2019, the New York Times, it was the subject of my book, so I know it more intimately than most other outlets, did this huge initiative called the 1619 Project that they published. It was a full issue of the Times Magazine, and it was really dedicated towards reframing American history from liberty, which is our traditional story that is told in America, to slavery. And they even put it in the name. 1619 was the year that slaves were first brought to the colonies. So the idea was to say 1776, when America declared independence, was not the true starting point of the nation. It was actually started in slavery. And even more to the point, and this is where things got a little weird, is that they considered America to be a slavocracy in their terms to this very day. So in everything from traffic jams to high sugar foods to the healthcare system that's a bit broken in the United States is all a remnant of a slave society, and it's why these things exist today in the way that they do. So this on its own is a very sort of audaciously breathtaking move, but the real problem came after the publication of the 1619 Project, when a bunch of scholars from top-tier universities came out and said, what you're saying can't possibly be true because it's not supported by the academic literature. So in one case, the New York Times even went out to a fact checker, a professor of African American history at Northwestern University, with a particular fact. And the fact was that they were trying to claim the American Revolutionary War was fought to preserve slavery, and she just told them flat out, no, that's just not true. And in her words, they printed it anyways. And this is the real point, is the facts didn't actually matter, and the facts were there to be subverted. It was the whole objective of the 1619 Project. This all happened right in the wake of Trump becoming president. What happened in journalism after Trump was elected, and even when he was just a candidate, was these same institutions started to come out and say, we need to rethink what we consider the true ultimate values of journalism to be, and that was generally understood to be objectivity is one of the main ones. The Times did a front page story by their media columnist, Jim Rutenberg, in August 2016, that was called "The Challenge Trump Poses to Objectivity." A few years later, they had a Pulitzer-winning reporter named Wes Lowry come out and say very much the same thing, and that was the idea that objectivity, I'll read you the quote. Conversations about objectivity, rather than happening in a virtuous vacuum, habitually focus on predicting whether a given sentence, paragraph, or article will appear objective to a theoretical reader who is invariably assumed to be white. So what Larry was saying, and he later said to a group of students at Columbia Journalism School that we have, quote unquote, fetishized objectivity. What he was actually saying was that objectivity is an artifact of white supremacy. And this tie is an interesting tie, obviously, but you might think that they would see objectivity as white and therefore it's bad. I don't think that's actually the dynamic. I think what they saw was that objectivity itself was bad, therefore it is white. The whiteness was a way to use it as a sort of a lever or a cleaver, maybe, to chop it to pieces. And that was really, I think, the point of this entire movement we've seen in the media since Trump's initial candidacy. And that's, I think, where we're starting to see this merging of clash of civilization with clash of civilizations, plural. The reason I say that is because when you look at 9/11, another seminal moment in American history, in modern American history, we have this initial attack. And the attack itself was horrible, and it was very traumatic for Americans, but it wasn't the real attack. The real attack is what came in the subsequent 20 years, where we started to hear that, and actually began right after 9/11, where we started to hear that this was America's fault. This wasn't a bunch of Islamist terrorists committing a massacre against innocent civilians. This was actually a just retribution for America's own misdeeds. And that itself was this kind of the first big moral turn away from an objective view of the world. And it was also carried by the media, which started to examine this notion very, very quickly after 9/11. We also saw the same type of attack and shifting of the moral perspective after October 7th. So what we saw was, again, a horrible initial physical attack, but that wasn't the real attack. The real attack is everything that came after that, which is the delegitimization of an entire state, a people, and it was the same thing with the United States. The real attack is delegitimization, and that is the point of this attempt to dislodge objectivity that we've seen carried through in the media. So what's key, I think, is that we're at a turning point. The one thing people don't talk about, we talk about the horrors of October 7th, and we've talked about the horrors of 9/11, but particularly in Israel, because it's a bit of a different case, and I lived in Israel for 20 years, I'm actually Israeli, just by my accent, is that on October 7th, Hamas also set off what I call an identity bomb. It changed people inside of Israel. It changed their enemy. It made their enemy that they had seen previously as being somewhat relativistic in their view, almost Western in that way, and kind of more interested in lifestyle and pleasures and this kind of thing, getting on in life. And they concretized their enemy into something that had to believe in itself because it had no choice. And this idea today that you can accept all perspectives, including the perspective that you should be dead, is a luxury belief. It's a luxury belief, what we're seeing play out in European capitals, in American blue cities and blue states. And I think it's only until the point that you no longer have the luxury to have that kind of belief that you will not see change. But I think what we're seeing from Israel is that change is possible, and it's there when it's forced. Sometimes it's a bit too late when you get to that point, and it becomes far more tragic than it needs to be. But that's how history often does play out. So in closing, I think what we can say is that The idea that the media has put into the world that 2 + 2 does not equal 4, or might not equal 4, depending on who you are, where you came from, what your background is somewhat over, at least in the United States. We saw that with the election of Trump, and we've even seen it now with the media sort of kissing the Trump ring, with people going to Mar-a-Lago from the media to say, okay, we did call you Hitler for the last 8 years, but you might actually not be so bad, because the people have eventually had their will and they have spoken. And we've heard this theme touched upon earlier, but the media is changing, and the media is almost being overwritten by a public that now has access to its own media. And I think that's going to have a profound impact as we go forward, as we confront this objectivity crisis. And in sum, what I would say about it all is that I think there is a lot more hope for the future than one might think, looking at the present. Thank you.
Please bear with me. I'm working on a little bit of a cold, so I hope I can get through this in 10 minutes. This is a little bit of an embarrassing moment for me, because when I listened to Frank Freire's speech today, I figured out he must have broken into my hotel room and steal my speech. So I had to rework an entirely new one, but then I figured out the true reason is, and many of you probably don't know this, that Frank and I, we are the human reincarnation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So naturally, of course, our ideas align during events like this. Now, I guess it's a horrible sin to start one's presentation with saying I don't agree with the premise of the presentation. Because I'm very optimistic, and I think that in fact the global nature of the culture war is in reverse. I think the global nature of the culture war, for example, was when you had rainbow flags in Kabul. And I think that's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. And the zenith of this movement, I believe, started and probably also ended with Barack Obama. I think it is no coincidence that Donald Trump was elected after Barack Obama. And kind of to highlight this a little bit, and this goes also to what Ashley was talking about, because I think the media plays a key role in this. Let me tell you a story, and bear with me, it has a fantastic plot twist at the end. And it's a very romantic story as well, so I think this is something when I can pull your heartstrings a little bit. So in early 2010, there was a great love story developing on the internet. The blogger in Syria, the Syrian blogger Amia, which was called a gay girl in Damascus, was striking up a romance with another blogger in the United States who ran the webpage Let's Get Real, run by Paula Brooks. A very romantic story, kind of everybody's multicultural dream in a sense. Now, unfortunately, as this budding love story was about to get real, it turned out that Amia's cousin reported that she was arrested. Her cousin reported that she was arrested by the Assad regime. So naturally, right, the US media jumped into gear, the Washington Post, the New York Times, somebody that you should know, actually, Peter Beinart, right, said the State Department has immediately investigated what's going on here. And they did. So they went over to Damascus and said, we have to free this blogger. Now, the Syrian authorities were struck by this request because they said, we have no idea what you're talking about. We have no idea who these people are. As it then turned out that, in fact, the Syrian blogger was Tom McMaster, a 40-year-old sociology student from Georgia. And the love interest he struck up turned out also not to have been a lesbian, because Paula Brooks, in fact, was a 58-year-old construction worker from Ohio. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this story is because if the media would have investigated, they could have easily found that out. But the story was just too good to be true. It was a story that the media wanted to believe. That's why they didn't investigate. That's why they didn't take a look at it. Nathan made excellent points today, but I just want to touch on one of his, which was that we have, or that one element of what we are faced with is nihilism. I don't think so much it's nihilism. I think the true nature of it is narcissism. Because that story tells you that, right? There was like, if your worldview seems to be reflected in such a wonderful story, you have no interest to investigate it any longer because you simply want it to be true. And one part of this, of course, and I think this came with Barack Obama as well, was when he was elected, Boris Johnson, another great disappointment for the conservative movement, said, Barack Obama spoke as a citizen of the world, and this is exactly what I was expecting from an American president. Robert Habeck, the current Minister of the Economy in Germany and self-declared candidate for the new chancellorship, once said in an interview, patriotism, I don't know what to do with that term. And my favorite example of all time was the once leader of the Canadian Liberal Party, Michael Ignatieff, who wanted to become the Prime Minister of Canada in 2007. And he said in an interview when being asked what Canada means to him, he said, well, if I should ever need a place to call home, it might as well be Canada. Now, as you can imagine, that did not go down very well with the Canadians, and he ended up going back to his profession as a professor in Harvard. And the same, of course, is this development that we see. It's the projection of our own priorities onto others. And I think this was the nature of the culture war. I give you another example. Usually I don't use my phone during presentations, but I want to get the quote right. And otherwise, they say I put words into other people's mouth. Andrew Sullivan, yet another very well-renowned blogger, in 2008 wrote the following, in all seriousness. It's November 2008. A young Pakistani Muslim is watching television and sees this man, Barack Hussein Obama, is the new face of America. In one simple image, America's soft power has been ratcheted up not by a notch, but a logarithm. If you wanted the crudest but most effective weapon against the demonization of America that fuels Islamist ideology, Obama's face gets close. So according to Mr. Sullivan, if you want to solve the global problems and the global conflicts from Ukraine to Gaza to China, forget about weapons. What you should do is drop portraits of Barack Obama to the Chinese, on Gaza, on Syria, and everywhere else. And once the people see the picture of him, they will say, you know what, we were wrong all along. If America is led by a man, by a black man, then all problems must be solvable. And again, this is the projection of the priors that we had in the West onto others. And I think what we're gradually and slowly learning is that most parts of the world don't see it this way. It certainly was a great achievement for the United States to have the first black president. But in Pakistan, in Russia, in China, they didn't really care about this. And as we know how the world has developed since 2008, right, the fact that Barack Obama was president, we can make the argument it didn't really change that much in international relations. And the other element, of course, of the narcissism that I think then also was reflected during Obama's presidency himself was he was once asked in an interview, do you believe in sin? And he said, yes, of course I believe in sin. And the reporter also said, and what is sin? And Obama's answer was, being out of alignment with my own values. And I think this encapsulates very nicely, if you want, the religion, if you want to use the term, or the idea of wokeness. It is worshipping at the altar of yourself. Right? The only measurement, the only standard that matters is yourself. And this is also why we have such phenomena like Queers for Palestine. Because the Queers for Palestine don't care about Palestine. I don't think they really care about queers either. Right? They care about themselves. Wokeness is, in the end, it's a form of institutionalized narcissism. And I think what we see gradually happening is that this is coming to an end. I want to give you another example that I think that shows that. Ashley was talking about October 7th. I think one of the more shocking events after October 7th was the Eurovision Song Contest in Sweden, where the Swedish police told the artist from Israel, which was a girl in her early 20s, that she cannot go out on the streets in public because there is the risk that she's going to get lynched. And if you looked at the judges at the Eurovision Song Contest, let's just say they were not really biased towards Israel. But if you look at how most people at home who could vote with their phones could cast their vote, they were very much pro-Israel. Because I think that they understood on a very fundamental basis kind of what was going on. That even a lot of the things that you see happening when it comes to international relations, again, is just another form of this form of narcissism. Kind of that you take every problem in the world and you want to project it onto yourself. But I think this is something that is, or at least something that I hope, that is gradually and surely coming to an end. And ironically, this is, I think, the great plot twist, I hope, of my presentation today is that many on the right actually have gone woke, but in a very, very positive sense. I give you just a handful of examples. The Conservative Party in Great Britain is now led by a woman of Nigerian descent. The AfD, the supposed Nazi party in Germany, is led by an open lesbian who lives in a same-sex marriage and has 2 adopted children. Again, which I would say is probably not exactly what Hitler was envisioning, if those would be his successors. And even more importantly, what you see in all these developments is that voters under 35 are flocking to these parties. Because believe it or not, you can be gay, right? You can be Muslim, you can be black, you can be everything, and you can be a conservative. And this is precisely what we saw with Donald Trump. He won not outright, but pretty much every minority group, or every group that is very often depicted as a minority, moved towards Trump. And I think there's a good reason for this, because more and more people are fed up with this kind of narcissism. We see, and we have the data for this, that tradition, the joining the Boy Scouts, the joining traditional associations is going up again. There is a sense, right, that excess narcissism, excess individuality has, as Nathan mentioned in his presentation, has led to loneliness, right? Has led to an epidemic of loneliness. And I think there is a growing movement that stands up against this. And we see this in the way that people express themselves. We see this particularly among the younger generation. And another very important kind of concluding phenomenon that I want to touch upon is, they did a recent poll in the United States, and they said, well, what do you think is going to be one of the most impactful consequences of Donald Trump's election? 41% said, I feel I can say things now that I couldn't say a year back. And that is very, very, very important. We currently have trends. I'm sure you all followed this. I know that Norman mentioned it before, right? That in Germany people get arrested, which is true, right? To have at least their houses searched for criticizing politicians. We have in the United Kingdom journalists who get visits from the police. But my sense is that this is kind of the last attempt to fight back from a dying regime, right? Because these are acts of desperation. If you truly control the culture, you don't have to do it. And the true strength of, if we want to use the term, because I agree with Frank, I'm not a fan myself, but if we use it just for this one time, if wokeness would be as strong as it once was, they could rely on people using self-censorship. Right? They could basically blackmail or cudgel you by the simple threat of something might be happened, you might be ostracized from society into not speaking your mind. But that's no longer working, because people are increasingly want to speak their mind, and they do so. So what you now see is that many of the institutions, of course, that are led by people that have been marinated in that worldview, they know they can no longer win the argument, which is, of course, why they lash out using state institutions. But for how long can they do this? And we already see that resistance to this is formulating. So as a concluding remark, I think the future is fairly, fairly bright. And I think, as Frank also said, some optimism is in place. We need to get hipper. I tried this with my shoes. As you can see, I abandoned the classic dress shoes and went with something more sportive. And on that note, I'm looking forward to the questions and the conversation.
Microphone working? Yes, lovely. So please do prepare your questions. Before I go out into the audience, I was thinking myself, listening to three of the speakers and where I would like to hook in and then start the conversation before opening to the public. I would like to bring us back to Europe, and I think Bill was well based in Europe in his speech and his points that he made. And linking to Ashley's points about the media, I'm afraid that in Europe we're really tied up with the old-style media that are controlling the narrative. The alternative media landscape is quite limited still, based on the language of the country and the infrastructure and kind of financial resources people have for starting this type of medium. And listening to the statistics on what was the perceptions of the results of the US elections in Europe, it was in stark contrast to the rest of the world. So it looks like that this control of the media narrative and lack of diversified alternative media is still playing the role. So would you like to comment on how do you see that playing out in Europe, knowing also that they are very keen on controlling the online conversation with hate speech laws and using the algorithms and so on to control the narrative?
Yeah, I think you can attempt to control it, but it's not something that can really be controlled because it is so decentralized, it's so diffuse, and it's irrepressible. I mean, when you look at the culture online on X, you really can't keep it down because we have this thing today called the meme. And the meme allows people to sort of bury a political message inside of a format that is unintelligible to an authority. And that's the part of the beauty of it. So like we're communicating in memes, communicating subversively and doing it in a way that is almost coded, and it's also too fast to keep up with it. By the time the meme has been out and has gone viral, you have like a bureaucrat somewhere here in Brussels pushing paper and getting authorizations and getting signatures. The moment's already gone. So I think a lot of this is going to shift to social media, already has. In terms of independent media, it is harder, but there's now infrastructure like Substack where you don't need to have a newsroom, you don't need to have a traditional publisher and a business side to the things. You can just do the thing yourself. And again, very hard to control that. You can get knocks on the door and you can get DSA notices, but you can only do that, so much of that if you're a centralized government body until it's just going to be completely out of hand.
Mm-hmm. That's quite interesting. Actually, that brought to my mind a lot of artistic works being done in Poland now, also including animations, actually criticizing the current coalition government with actually artistic form, not just a meme, but actual animations, which is really fascinating. Now, do we have to wait, Ralph, do you think that we have to wait for this wave of counterculture annihilating this narcissism and the cult of narcissism? Because when I lived in London for 20 years and I moved to Poland, then I had an impression that all of the bad things that happened in Britain are only starting to take root in Poland, and I'm like a traveler from the future, and I'm trying to wake people up and just say, this is coming your way, be prepared, listen to what I can tell you in preparation for that. And nobody wanted to listen, only just few. So do we have to be just passive and wait for this wave to come to us, or what can we actually do to be proactive, apart from being cool?
Well, I guess the first step is no longer being ashamed of it. I mean, if somebody asks me, I have absolutely no problem in calling myself a nationalist. And there was a time when my cheeks got red and I felt a flush of embarrassment. No longer. It's a sentiment. I think it's a good sentiment. And there's, by the way, a very interesting phenomenon that is completely underappreciated, and we see it, I think, also in this room today, which is that there was always the idea that patriotism and nationalism, whichever term you want to use, is an isolating force. But I think it's the exact opposite, because only if I love my country, I can understand that somebody else loves their country as well. And this is what always bothered me, as I meant in my presentation. If somebody says they're a citizen of the world, what does that, I mean, it sounds nice, but that's a meaningless platitude. The only place where you can be a citizen of the world is in the West. Right? Somewhere, because we kind of tolerate those ideas, but elsewhere it doesn't work. And kind of just making, particularly among young people, kind of allowing them to express those sentiments, those feelings again. I think it's also, without getting into too much detail, I think it's also psychologically healthy. People need a home, not just physically, but also emotionally. We have the evidence is overwhelming that being part of a community, having a sense of there is something that is larger than yourself, that you are not just an isolated individual that exists in one point in time, but that you're actually part of a longer chain that reaches back into the past and reaches into the future, is very important. And yes, we all know that most countries are built on myth and the way we tell our history is not entirely true. Yes, that's again, all of this is correct, but so what? I don't think there's a myth is a negative thing. If somebody says, is a nation state a physical reality? No, if you look at the world from space, you don't see the Austro-German border or the Austro-Hungarian border. But it's something that people sense, that they feel, and this is also, just as the last point, this is what makes human life worthwhile, right? The experience of something that goes beyond your mere existence.
It's not easy to be a lady here.
Tell me.
This is the last thing I'm going to take off on stage. I'm sorry. Bill, I think I really found your points important, because the way the whole panel was framed, it was in relation to our autonomy and strength and the vision. But if we don't have the material means and infrastructure and in a sense, framing that helps us to maintain it and even actually improve it or even go beyond that, what are we supposed to do? Because we look like how Europeans are trying to veto the Green Deal. The farmers are coming to protest. Then they get the letter that actually they have to sell at the lower rate, otherwise they just go bankrupt. We see the revolt of the farmers in Britain now. So what is the way for the ordinary citizen? If they vote for certain parties and then there is cordon sanitaire, they don't seem to get anywhere. So are we just facing this frustration building up and there is no way out for us, or is there another way?
I think there's quite a lot of questions in that. Look, if there's one theme, I think, in common on this panel, or two, It's that we need to have a sense of belonging to a shared community, one that we can hold accountable democratically, and that we need a greater sense of belief in ourselves, who we are, what we stand for, and where we're going. And it's, like I think Frank alluded in the opening session to, during the Cold War, there was a kind of free market right and a socialist left. They believed in their project. You might not have agreed with their project, and plenty of people disagreed, but at least there was the opportunity for that combative dialogue. What I'm presenting to you today, as I have done actually quite some time ago in the past, is that we now live in a society that doesn't believe in anything. And that's incredibly damaging. Because then when you see someone else who appears to believe in something, whether it's Islam or even Christianity, you're really shocked by that. How is it possible to believe? And so you accuse them of being fundamentalists or fanatics. But actually, they're probably not that different to Muslims in the past and Christians in the past. And so I think to me that's it's the twin elements of belief and belonging that we need to restore.
Mm-hmm. Actually, it's interesting when you said that they find it quite scary that they believe in something. I actually think that they try to use therapy and any other humanistic knowledge-based systems to manage them. So they think maybe if you get a car, or maybe if the school is better in the place where you live, that will kind of stop you holding these values very dear to you and actually adhering to them, which I think is quite fascinating. So I'm really interested in the questions and comments from the floor. Are there any ready questions? Yes, there is the first one in the middle. Please, Tony. And then everyone else, please prepare yourself. I'm looking out. Yes, I see here. Okay. So first Tony, and then here, one. And there, lady here.
Okay, so thanks very much. It's a question for anyone, particularly, if you like, sparked by you, Bill, but a question for anyone. Because you talked a lot about believing in ourselves. And I guess I'd like to believe that was going to happen. And I'll be really honest with you. Maybe I was badly educated, but we often talk about the importance of the Judeo-Christian religion and traditions, etc. Reality is, the education I had led me to go to the University of Oxford, but I didn't learn any of those traditions. And I'm 55, okay? So that belief coming from somewhere substantial, some sort of foundations, has not been there for a very, very long time. I was quite lucky to be educated at a good state school, but they stopped teaching Latin when I joined that state school. And I was very lucky that Oxford University dropped the requirement for Latin, okay? So this is going back 50 years. And just to finish the story, after I graduated with PPE at Oxford, I decided to travel the world. Go explore Asia and India and Singapore, and Thailand was particularly good fun. I really had a great time. And I went there because I didn't really believe in the country in which I was living in. And that continued, to be honest, for a long, long time. And it's only recently that I've begun to see the problem with it. So my question to all three of you is, if we are going to create a genuine sense of belief, and there's a few people in the room who are younger than me, if we're going to create a genuine sense of belief, how do we do that? What are the steps, given that this has been a problem for more than 50 years?
Mm-hmm, thank you. Here, the gentleman on the right.
Hi, Kyle Green, a barrister at law. To Bill's point about diversity, if I may, my favourite, and this reveals my own personal self-righteous views, you might say, because being an Irishman, my favourite philosopher is a Scottish man named David Hume, and his quote goes like, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave to the passions, and can never pretend to any device other than to serve and obey them." And I believe that is to say that when it comes to issues of diversity and moral judgment, it's our passions that come first, and it is the reasoning and the logic that often come second to justify those passions. Now that leads me to my next point, which is that Jonathan Haidt has a very good view and framework, in my view, on the issue of diversity. He discusses the difference between demographic diversity and cultural diversity. Now, we see different demographics here, all of which in many ways are a great thing for society to have. But then we also see many different cultures, and on that point, we have cultures that are compatible and cultures that are simply not compatible. So I would like to think that everyone in this room is part of a culture, we're all very compatible despite our differences. But there are cultures that simply are not compatible with other cultures. And to resolve those issues is not something that can be resolved with reintegration programs, et cetera, et cetera. These are intergenerational, in my view, issues. And my question is that simply a fatalistic problem, or is that something that can be addressed with some sort of inspirational view as to the future of our countries? And in my view, that's something like nationalism or patriotism. Thank you.
Thank you. Ashley here. Any other questions on the right here? Okay. Cornelis.
Ashley Frawley, visiting researcher, MCC Brussels. I was just interested in something that Ashley Winsberg said about objectivity. Because there's a bit of a paradox happening where even the most profoundly, seemingly anti-scientific outlooks use so-called science to back up their points. So gender activists claim that they have science on their side. They will say, oh, I'm anti-scientific. Oh, but I have all these doctors on my side. And they explicitly chased out of the academy anybody who disagreed so that they could say they had science on their side. And I think it's often misunderstood that wokeness is, anything goes, it's all very anti-scientific. It is, but at the same time, they use science and a claim to objectivity to prove their point. So I wondered if you could speak to that paradox.
Thank you. Yes, one more, and then we're going to come back to the panel.
Cornelis Scholtz, an actual teacher, teaching here in Brussels at one of the two so-called free universities, who are not free, just in case you're wondering. The word education has not really been part of this conversation until Ashley intervened, so thank you for that. I'm less optimistic than Ralph, I'm afraid, because I teach at a university. The 1619 project is part of the core curriculum of history in the United States. Now, Donald Trump says he's going to do something against it, and the Rufo in Florida has been trying to get rid of it. But it got hold of universities because it played into what was already there. We conservatives have abandoned university education a long, long time ago, and we're now reaping the sour fruits of that. So I don't think we're there yet. I think we haven't seen the worst. And I wonder what sort of solutions the panel could think of in terms of how can we save the universities? Can they be saved at all? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ralph, would you like to address Tony's question on this genuine sense of belief and direction?
Well, I would also like to address the Scottish gentleman's question, because I think the David Hume quote is the David Hume, or Irish. I apologize. Horrible. The nationalists cannot distinguish the nationalities. Here we start. But it's because it's a great quote. But I would like to use the quote by another great Scotsman, Adam Smith, right, who once wrote that the purpose of a proper education is to channel passions into the right directions, or into proper things, is what he said. Because I think that's true, that the passions tend to win out over reason. But the question is always, what are we passionate about? And I think what we, for example, going back to what Cornelius said, the problem at university is precisely this: if you go into a university and you are being taught that your culture, your civilization is only bad and it's responsible for the worst things that happened in history, then goes back to what Bill also said. If I'm then a migrant, why would I ever want to integrate in such a culture? Like, if I don't know, if I want to introduce Ashley to a friend of mine and say, by the way, this is the most horrible person you're ever going to meet, he's probably not going to want to hang out with that person. And I think it's the same with migration. If you put people into a school system and I think this happened in the UK, where then the teacher are more or less segregating the white pupils and the non-white pupils, and kind of tell the non-white pupils, to say what's great about their culture, and tell the white pupils to say what's horrible about their culture. I mean, that's a very unhealthy way, I think, to treat children. And it also brings us, of course, back to it's a little bit of a trope, but it's true, that, one person's education is another person's indoctrination. And this has been a little bit a mistake, as you correctly pointed out. On the right, there was this idea that the universities and culture
culture and media. We don't need this. If people just make their cross next to a guy that is a conservative at every election, then we're gonna be fine. But there's the big difference between being in power and just being in office. The right has in the last years very often been in office. They don't have really been in power, and I think that needs to be changed. Some people would say we have, metaphorically, to burn down the existing universities and build our own ones. I think this is what the university in Austin is trying. This is what some other smaller institutions are trying. So I think that's the way to go. And I agree. I don't think that this thing is going to be won tomorrow. But I think the trend is there. Like, the conversations we are having here, and also what you see in the media, they are different. And you saw this just at the last quick point. This was again, the irony is there was this big sigh of relief on the left when Donald Trump lost, or as he would say, he didn't lose but didn't get the presidency in 2020. But I think this 4-year hiatus was absolutely important, because it was a last push against further to the left. And then you had just a couple of months ago, if you have Elon Musk, whatever you think of him, and Joe Rogan, and kind of many of these cultural figures switching to your side, and those are just the ones who did it openly. We don't know how many did it in secret. I mean, I also think that Joe Biden probably voted for Donald Trump for a different reason. I think that shows you that something is going on. But I agree with you. Like, we cannot make the same mistake now to just lean back and say, the pendulum is swinging to the other direction, so I have nothing to do. Of course, we have stuff to do as well, yes.
Great. Bill, would you like to pick on anything?
Well, actually, that was one of the points I would have picked on Ralph's initial presentation, that there are optimistic signs, but we can't count on their failure to determine our project. It's down to each and every one of us to live the values that we want to exemplify and encourage others to live by, and then they judge according to who appears to be attractive and successful to them. I think we need to get the balance right. There's quite a lot of trite examples have been thrown around, which they're nice, but like Boy Scouts are up, wow. And Nathan this morning talked about, it's almost radical to have marriage and children today. And it kind of reminded me, actually, there was a hippie poster doing the rounds in the Vietnam War, which is very famous, which was, and the poster said, "Make love, not war." And there was a picture of a woman on it. And one of the wags at King's College London drew a pregnancy bulge on the woman and underneath wrote, "I wish I'd made war." And so, don't assume, don't fall in for kind of lazy tropes, memes, or anything. Like, everyone's got to work out, their own path. Now, I think the passion point's very important, but, diplomacy should not be based on passion. That's the problem. I think that's what Frank was alluding to this morning. There's no accounting for taste. And so it's a good, let a million flowers bloom at the levels of passion and taste. But when we come to diplomacy, we need to have a generation who are educated to speak foreign languages. I think it's an absolute scandal that in the British education system, language education at university is now almost entirely the preserve of privately educated children, because state schools no longer, it's not even Latin, it's everything else, French, German, Italian, Spanish. And just on that, our culture's incompatible. I like to remind people, in New York 100 years ago, Poles lived side by side with Swedes and Irish and Greeks. They had their own community, and Jews. There were 67 Polish language newspapers, weekly newspapers in New York alone. It was probably a more diverse community than it is today. And I think, what you have to ask yourself is, why could it happen then, and why can't it happen now? And that's something to do with how we have changed and corroded from within.
Mm-hmm. Ashley?
I think, the question about how to create belief, I think it's a great question. I just don't think it has an answer. Either it's going to happen or not, because belief is not something you fake. It's not something you deliberately select, and I'm going to believe this now, and so is everyone around me. It's going to happen, and generally it's going to happen because things get really bad. And when things get really bad, you turn to higher orders of belief to try to understand what's going on in the world around you, make sense of it. As for the university thing, definitely academia is upstream of all these issues, absolutely. It's upstream of media too. How do you solve that? My personal opinion, it's not going to be a very popular one, but is defund the humanities. Let the humanities take care of themselves. Science can do its thing. We can continue to have progress, but quarantine the humanities from science. And that leads to the other question about the sciences, which is that, yes, science has been captured, but the science that you were referring to is a lot of social science, and the hard sciences too. But I think the key answer to this is that it's the media that provides the linkage between what the scientists might declare and what everyone is then told to believe. So they identify, this happened during COVID, or the COVID origin stuff, like where did it come from? I reported on this a lot. So you have like 30% of them saying it came from a lab, 30% of them, the consensus, they're still not today. But the media takes the little point that it's been instructed to take in this case, or sometimes that it finds ideologically suitable, and then just plasters it everywhere. So I think this is a media question as much as anything.
Right, any more questions? So here I'm going to pick up one at the back, then one in the middle here, and on that side. Yes, the gentleman at the back. Yeah.
Thank you. Tatiana Hashimi, anthropologist. I would like to ask you if Donald Trump and Elon Musk could definitely restore some free speech and change the media landscape.
Mm-hmm. Yes, here, gentleman at the back, and then here in the middle, Richard.
Robert Kerr again. Just two comments. I think we have to be, if we could put a little discussion on culture, because Trump might have won, but it's certainly clear that what Americans understand under culture and what Europeans generally understand under culture are somewhat related, but two different things. And what you were saying with culture and conviction, we need, when Heine did a tour of the French cathedrals in the early 19th century, and they looked at the Cathedral of Rouen, and his friend asked him, why can't we build that today? That was in 1830. Heine replied, because we only have opinions today, we don't have belief. We need to believe something for culture to exist. And for Ralph's comment, I agree, it's dying, because wokeism can only die because it's self-destructive. Because if it used to be you had more rights because you were gay, now you have to be gay and a Martian and one-legged and with green hair. But the question is, and this is what we have to be aware of, when it's in its dying throes, how much destruction can it reap? Because as a university professor, I can say that, good, we can isolate the universities because it's crept into medicine in the meantime, wokeism, not just the humanities. But people under 30, they're nearly impossible to teach because, as you said, they have no background knowledge. Sorry for speaking too long.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Here, Frank, in the first row.
Yeah, I mean, I usually agree with
the
Ralph.
microphone. Sorry.
I usually agree with Ralph, but I think you're a little bit too optimistic about the dynamic at the moment. I mean, the way that I look at it is that something very important has happened in the American election. And the important that happened was that for the first time in my own lifetime, identity politics had a major setback. Because contrary to what Harris wanted, a significant section of the Hispanic community and a smaller section of the black community rejected identity politics altogether. That's the first time that that has happened. And I was really glad because it indicates that there is something in the air that gives us ground for the kind of optimism that you have. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember that the institutions of culture, whether it's from Hollywood or it's the media, the museums, the universities, and most important of all, the schools, are still running full flow. And they're still indoctrinating children as young as 5 or 6, as they go into the nurseries, into the schools. And there is no challenge there. I mean, within the education system, there is only a minority of parents who have kicked up against it or homeschooling or anything else. And therefore, what I really worry about is that the whole kind of energy that identity politics has isn't something that remains uncontained for the very simple reason that the influential section of society are still able to very freely sort of promote that. And you made some very important points about the fact that we don't have to censor ourselves. in the way we did in the past, and I think that's really important. But I do think that we have to understand that nothing is going to happen, nothing is going to change that's qualitatively different until our side, that's people like ourselves in this room, get their act together and develop a more mature, a more grown-up, a more sophisticated account of an alternative narrative that's happening. And at the moment, we still haven't got enough of an intellectual class. We need more intellectuals to join our ranks, because it's only when we have a slightly larger mass of individuals that we can execute a kind of Gramscian reverse process and try to challenge effectively the hegemony. The good thing that Ralph said is we need to be optimistic. We need to believe in ourselves. But I think the very moment that we think about it, we also have to understand that we have an incredible challenge ahead of us. And that's not going to go away, but it is exciting. I mean, it's incredible when you think that if we get this right, we can make history, and we can even play a small role in saving Western civilization.
Yes?
Jenny Bristow, UK. I think the elite abandonment of the humanities and then its ensuing corruption is probably why we're in the mess we are in now, so I wouldn't go down that line myself. My question is based on something that I'm struggling with in my own work, which is it's about the relationship between kind of material and symbolic realities, and that sense that we have a whole set of competing versions of reality operating, which is partly generational and partly to do with media fragmentation, the gap between the elite and the masses and everything else. On the other hand, you have a shared kind of material reality still, I think, within communities, as opposed to the imagined online communities. You have this, you do have kind of everyday life, and then you have populism, you have the farmers' protests, you have reminders of that. And so what would the panel think is the balance between that at the moment? Because I mean, clearly, these kind of symbolic realities have very real consequences, as we're seeing geopolitically. So I'm not saying they're any less real, but there does seem to be a kind of an interesting and quite creative tension between these two zones of life that we're operating in.
Thank you. Before I come back to the panel, please, I would like some questions from the younger members of the audience. Don't get off the hook. I can see your faces from the stage. So this is your future. Sooner or later, me and others will be gone, and you will have to stay here and deal with that. So think about your questions. So, Bill, would you like to pick on anything?
Well, I guess I'll start with Tatiana's question about Trump and Musk and are they the saviors of free speech? I think all the evidence is that they don't really understand the concept themselves and are actually quite thin-skinned when it comes to criticism of their own views. And so we need to be careful not to put all our eggs in one basket. I think actually one point I wanted to pick up with Ashley when he says that the media has replaced all other institutions. That's not actually how I see it. I think what actually happened, if you follow Putnam's work, for instance, or others, is that it's all other institutions have fallen apart, and the media became the last institution left standing. And so now everybody's lobbing bombs at the media. But actually, be careful what you do. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate, the difference between social media and legacy media. But in my view, all the same problems that have impacted legacy media will come to affect social media too. And so what really matters is to, argue for good journalism, high-quality journalism, irrespective of the outlet that it comes through. Just one quick thing. Frank makes an entirely valid point that our side needs to get its act together. I mean, you just have to look, there's like constantly self-thwarting. The right in Europe nominally should be the majority, but Zemmour is at Le Pen's throat, Badinot becomes prime minister, and all the conservatives start attacking her. And even things like the farmers' protests, we need to understand that there are different reasons for these farmers' protests, and unless we tease them out, unless we're willing to actually force them to confront their differences, we're not really building a constituency. We're just having an illusion of numbers. There's what I like to call hobby farmers who are, like run very, very small scale, obsessively organic stuff, compared to the people who actually feed us and put everything or most of the stuff that was out on your plates at lunchtime together, and they have quite different interests. Don't presume that all these, it's a lazy thing to do to just have the numbers and think we're all in it together, because it's when push comes to a shove is when you'll realize, actually, no, that they don't agree with you. And so it's really important that we have these arguments out now. Okay.
Thank you. Ashley?
Yeah, I think the media question, including fragmentation and the tension between, reality, like I always say to people, when you look on X or formerly Twitter, and it's apocalyptic. It's like, oh my God, things like we need to get into the bunker right now. And then you look out the window and there's like birds tweeting and there's grass and kids are playing and it looks really nice. But that, I think both have some purchase on reality, because there is a political reality on social media that is unfolding in a cultural reality. And then there's just kind of a humdrum day-to-day reality that's, going to the post office type stuff. But on social media itself, what we're seeing is fragmentation, which it's, walled gardens, not in a bad way though. I think this is one of the positive signs, where a friend of mine always compared Twitter or X to the prison yard, where all the gangs are there at the same time in a closed space, and it's just a matter of time before someone gets shivved. Whereas now we're seeing this exodus from of blue political people to blue sky, the alternative social network, and that's good for everybody because they have a space for them, other people have the space for themselves. We have different spaces on Telegram or on Discord where you can go and contain that friction and talk in the same language. You're previously on social media, including today on X, you're using the same words nominally, but with different meanings. You're speaking past each other. It's like Thomas Kuhn's definition of incommensurate science. Like the meanings are completely different. So if you can go to places where people understand each other and they speak the same language, then you, I think, have we have less discord than what we have today. And I think that's generally a good thing for society. I think, I think this is where we're trending. What we're seeing with Joe Rogan as an example is that Joe Rogan will bring someone from the far right, someone from the far left, back to back in different days. So you are having these synapse points where you're getting a multiple perspective outlook on whatever issue is at hand, and it's mediated by Joe. And he may not be an honest broker to everybody, but at least it is mediated. So again, I see a lot of hope in where media is going on that side of things. On the other side of things, the legacy media, they're moderating a little bit, but it's, for so many reasons, from the business model to the format to the, that it's piped in, it's linear, that there's not much that they can change without fundamentally destroying their businesses. This is something that Bill was just talking about, which is that good journalism should come from wherever it comes from, and that's 100% correct, but the problem is that it's not correct for the New York Times, because the New York Times needs to have its masthead on everything. Otherwise it doesn't get the value that's accrued from that journalism. So what we saw, I'll wrap up, this is going a little long, but with Spotify, we saw the unbundling of music from an album into whatever song you want to listen to. I don't need the album, and I definitely don't need the record label. And that is where media should go if it was trying to actually serve its audience, which is like, just give me this article, that article, that article. One happens to be from a right-wing outlet, one from a left-wing, one from a center. But the media itself can't allow that to happen because it would disintegrate their businesses. So they're holding on to an old format in order to maintain a business model that is outdated.
Right?
Well, I would just say is one thing. It was either, I don't know if it was the Jesuits or Socrates who said, give me the boy at 7 and I show you the man. And I think that's the key thing. Even here in this setting, now we very often talk about the universities, but I think education starts at kindergarten. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of couples out there who would love to send their children to, let's call it quote unquote, conservative kindergartens, conservative schools, where the children are not indoctrinated in a left-leaning worldview. But these institutions very often don't exist. I mean, Bill, with whom I always have a little bit of a kerfuffle on the stage, so he could not resist provoking me, so I have to retaliate, of course. He mocks the Boy Scouts. But of course, first of all, the Boy Scouts were created for that very reason by a veteran of the Boer War in the 19th century, because there was a certain fear that British society was getting too soft. Again, maybe this was a panic reaction, I don't know, but the idea of having institutions that instill values is absolutely important. And the right for too long had a libertarian attitude. They said, well, in schools they learn math, they learn these things, and in kindergartens they just play, when in reality we know now that actually there was significant ideological indoctrination taking place. So if you have a child, a young girl, a young boy, you name it, that has been indoctrinated, marinated in a worldview from the age of 7 until the age of 18, and then we say, but at the age of 18 at university, we're gonna get them. Good luck with that, right? This is kind of, you have to deprogram and then reprogram them. I would rather do this from the beginning, and I want to be completely honest to you. I think indoctrination should take place. Of course it should take place. It makes no sense. When we say that our society is built, like in Belgium, in Austria, in Germany, that the way in which we are structured is as a nation state, then of course you have to educate, or as I said, or you can call it indoctrinate, young people into understanding that very structure. It's very odd to say, you're Austrian, but in truth, you're a citizen of the world. That is very confusing. Like, you know, you hold a passport of a certain country. That must have meaning. We have created a world where we say a passport is not more than a piece of paper. But it should be more, right? There is something connected to it. But this is something you have to educate people in. And just as a last quick point, we know this. We talked about this today. Nathan mentioned it, that in China they're very keen on understanding Western philosophy. I mean, this was one of the key points of, from Aristotle to Socrates to Plato, was what is one of the most important things of a political regime? It's education, is what you teach your young people. They would have never said, we don't care what they learn at a young age. They understood very well what you teach them at a young age is going to have a huge effect afterwards. And this is my advice to people in the audience. If you think, should I become a kindergarten teacher or a professor, I say, please become a kindergarten teacher, because this is the area, this is the front line that we have entirely neglected.
The problem is they all want to become consultants.
Here I'm with Bill, don't do that.
Yeah.
Right, there's a question at the front. My colleague is signaling to me.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to return a bit to the fourth pillar, the media, as it were, as it's called, sometimes referred to. Well, China is busy excluding CRI, ESG, and DEI. They're busy trying to filter those out. And they learned a hard lesson by using fear-based repression in their media, and then they got away from it. They use what's now referred to as porous censorship, meaning they allow a certain group of people, the largest group of people, to have access to the media, to social media, and to the legacy media, for example, but they still target specific people. This is an ironic dichotomy, because in the West we're doing just the opposite. We are silencing and censoring conservative voices. Conservative voices being hushed and being quieted down. So I just wanted to make that point and see if you had any comments on that.
Great, thank you. Any more questions? I think there was a question here. Yes, still? No? And then the next, the gentleman behind Richard, yeah?
I'm going to address my question.
Do you mind standing up, please,
Okay.
so then we can see you and hear
to-
you?
What's his name? Schulhammer?
You can call me Ralph.
Ralph. Okay. Don't you, you talked about the education system. Don't you think we, at this point, need to challenge the state? Because what I see happening is state-sanctioned indoctrination. Doesn't the state have should be held accountable for what they are doing to the children?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And young gentleman?
Yeah, hi, student here in Brussels, first year. And what would you advise us students who might say are conservative or are a little bit nationalist? You mentioned you're a nationalist. How should we convince other people, especially here in Brussels, because it's very hard, in a sort of in a mass way? Because I've had conversations like with just one-to-one conversations where I am able to convince people of maybe a different point of view, even if they are. I had a conversation with this Greenpeace activist girl a couple of days ago, and I was trying to explain her. I'm originally from Slovakia, and I was trying to explain to her a little bit of the conservative side. But doing it through social media is very hard, And these days, even after Trump won, everything I saw on social media was just edits of him like being a god, and the West is now saved. And you won't convince young people with this kind of rhetoric and these kind of videos. Like, how should we address the masses, and especially young people and students? Because the way it's being done right now, in my opinion, is not the correct way.
Thank you. Great. I see more young hands lifted up, please, here on the side. Great.
Thank you for the nice panel discussion. I wanted to ask if the panel believes if there is any link between culture and ethnicity. In the sense that my question is, if Flanders, for example, would be inhabited in 100 years by 70% Han Chinese, ethnically Han Chinese people, do you think we would have still the same Flemish culture, which encapsulates the churches, which encapsulates our religion, and so on? Do you think someone can become part of a culture just by believing the right set of axioms?
Thank you. At the back there, Benza. And let me look to the right.
No, thank you. The term liberal and conservative, at least for me as a 25-year-old, seems to be kind of a blurred line at this point, because I grew up on YouTube and social media, and for me, I mean, the question of immigration or LGBTQ rights, I mean, I've seen so many things and I've experienced so many things that just for me to say these topics are so far away from me, I would be just simply lying. So with the youth-related question, what would you say to us in these conflicts and these debates? When do you think should we be, or should we reserve ourselves? Just being conservative is no longer an opportunity. Is it old-fashioned for us to be conservative?
Thank you. Any more questions on this side of the room? Because I'm sorry, it's hard for me to see with the lectern. Any more questions? No? So maybe with the answers now and comments, we just draw it to a close. So if you also can please and pick up it. What do you choose? Ralph, would you like to start first for a change?
Yeah, for the first, yes, I completely agree. I think the state should be held responsible, up 100%. I mean, I think this was one other strategic mistake very often undertaken by the right, was this idea that the state is a neutral institution. When it comes to, and Frank mentioned this also before, but when it comes to the relationship between the state, power, and the population, I think the left always understood this better than the right. This is something, and you can go, like historically, you can go, whether it was the Bolsheviks, whether it was the National Socialists, the understanding that the party, that everybody needs to be kept in line and everybody needs to work towards an ideological goal. You also see it in the United States, right? The Democrat Party, whether you like them or dislike them, they're a very disciplined party because loyalty to the party goes, above everything. So I think you're 100% right. I think that there should be a reckoning also for the state. The question of the gentleman, no. Like, I fully reject the idea that your ethnicity or your genetic makeup or your skin color or so has any permanent bearing on your possibility to join a culture. Maybe I should clarify, as that I'm not a little bit, as the gentleman said, a nationalist. I'm a full-blown nationalist, but I'm a cultural nationalist. So I believe if somebody moves from Nigeria to Austria, it will be more difficult to become Austrian. But once the children are born, those children, if the parents allow it, and if the system allows it, those children will be full-blown Austrian. And I don't care if they're black, white, if they're Asian inheritance. I have, within the Austrian right-wing party, within the AfD in Germany, there are party members that are of Asian descent, they are of Middle Eastern descent, and they are just as nationalist as I am, and nobody should have a problem with that. So I think, and there are people who have been in Germany for generations who are much less patriotic than they are. So no, I think that's a dangerous road that I'm glad you mentioned. Is I see that this is coming up again a little bit on the right, this kind of ethno-nationalism. I see that this is coming up again a little bit on the right, this kind of ethno-nationalism, and I think this is something the right has to be careful about, right? Being conservative, being right-wing, being a nationalist is a cultural term, is a cultural term, a values-based term. It's not a skin color-based term. So I find this trend that you see, again, with some on the fringes for now, that you say, oh, well, if you hail from outside of Europe, you can never become a European. I think that's wrong. So I would argue that, yeah, you can become a full-blown, whatever you choose to be, particularly in the second generation.
Thank you. Ashley?
So I would say to the guy who asked about conservative and liberal or whatever, how to define yourself, because some of those definitions are murky nowadays, I would kind of just forget about them and dive into specific political philosophies that speak to you. So if it's something Straussian, or if it's something from the left, if it's whatever it might be, but find the specific thinkers that you like. You know, go look at what Kissinger was doing and see who talks to you, and you'll form your own view of political philosophy that doesn't really have to attach itself to left, right, or whatever else. To the guy who asked about social media and how to speak to people who might have a little bit of a different opinion than you on a mass scale, so I think social media is the answer. One-on-one is great, but you can reach so many more people. But even more importantly, if you up your game on social media, meaning if you create better and better content, invest in content in topics that are deeply interesting to you and meaningful to you, you will not only affect people, but you will also articulate what you are really trying to say to the world in doing so. So it's about, rather than trying to tweet 100 times a day, try to do one piece of really good social media content per week or per month even, where you've like created something you're proud of, and then keep doing it, and you'll see the impact absolutely will accrue to you and to the people around you. And then I think we had a comment about the media and top-down control, where in the US, obviously, there is top-down control of the media. Media is controlled in the United States by a few very big corporations, Comcast and Disney among them. These are multi-billion-dollar corporations that they have a financial interest, they have an ideological interest. But I think what we saw with Trump, and this is why Trump it actually is important, is that he was able to overcome that. He was able to sort of defeat that system. And he did it on this wave of popular support that as I mentioned before, sort of rose up and was fermented on social media. So it's a complete shift in the power dynamic of the media, where they realize they lost. Like, you can see it on their faces, and they're actually starting to change. They're changing staff lineup. They're changing executives. They are selling off. Comcast is now selling off MSNBC. This was announced this past week, because it realizes where the public is and where its business lies. And this is something that capitalism does have a democratizing effect once it's allowed to, once that elite control, that clampdown was like, finally someone released their grip. So I think that's the incredible positive thing about it. And I think Trump will probably challenge the bigger establishment that exists on a global scale that we've all been sort of referring to here. And I think he's the one guy that has the power and the political will to do it.
Thank you. Bill?
I fear Trump is more ambiguous than that. But on the question of if Flanders in 100 years' time is populated by Han Chinese, will it still have the same beliefs and go to church? You know, if Flanders in 100 years' time is inhabited by Flemish people who have the same beliefs and go to church, that would be an equal disaster. You know, because the world changes and cultures change. And actually, the real challenge is to integrate anybody who comes here into our outlook, our values, our way of doing things, and to then see where we go from that. No society is the same as it was 100 years ago. New York is not the same as it was 100 years ago. So I think, you know, we've got to stop any kind of romantic attachment to the past and understand that. Another point, obviously, me and Ralph, as you can detect, have the occasional spat. You know, I would be extremely cautious of talking of things like our indoctrination, yeah? Because I don't believe that's actually what we want to do. We're not indoctrinating our children. It's more to do with our values, which come from living actions and how we live our lives in a community. It reminds me of Richard Dawkins, who you will all know as a pretty poor social biologist and an even worse critic of religion. And his big thing was to go around to religious people and tell them, you're wrong, God doesn't exist. And you're kind of thinking, you obviously haven't understood the Enlightenment concept of tolerance, Richard. You know, because the concept of tolerance is about let people believe what it is that they choose to believe. You don't have to lambast them for them. Live your own life. And if you are, by your example, more successful, more productive, more balanced than they are, maybe you will bring other people to you. But you don't need to go and rub people's face in it and say, you're wrong, and I'm going to indoctrinate you in a different way. Very final point. I was speaking at a London conference just a few weeks ago called the Battle of Ideas, which you should all come to. And I was on a panel called Is Western Civilization Under Siege? And superficially, everybody on the panel agreed. I knew the first speaker was going to agree because I had sent her my previous speech on the same theme from a summer conference I spoke at. But it's only when the questions started coming in that I realized that one of the panelists obviously had a bugbear about, Muslims this, Muslims that, their culture is different. And you can kind of see that actually he hasn't. He says that Western civilization is under siege from within, but he lives out that actually the challenge comes from without. And I'll conclude with what I said to him. I have more in common with a Muslim shopkeeper on Tottenham Court Road in London, that's where they sell computers and hi-fi, who works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in order to make enough money to send his children to a good school. I have more in common with that person than I have with a white, cisgendered, middle-class, aging, balding, bespectacled animal rights activist who sets fire to an Oxford University boathouse. Your values are what you do, and don't be fooled by the belief systems and colours that people bring to this. The problem we have with borders and values are to do with our elites, and they weren't forced upon us by any community that migrated here.
Thank you. Before I let you all go and we thank our speakers, I just wanted to let you know that we have half an hour break for coffee. Please, big thank you. I think we have a lot to think about during our break, and I welcome you back at 3:30 for the final session. Thank you.